We have already seen the impact on GDP numbers can come from a change in the base year. A typical example in the recent times was India, when the base year was changed from 2005 to 2012. The GDP growth for 2013-14 shot up to 6.9% from 5%. Now, why we need to use a base year? We have already seen the motivation for it, because by using a base year, we are able to correct for inflation while measuring the GDP. And this use of the base year as a concept helps us to distinguish between two different forms of GDP. One is the real GDP and other is the nominal GDP. Now, what is the difference between the two? We will see that through an example. Broadly, we are saying that once the real GDP is corrected for inflation, whereas the nominal GDP is a combination of the growth in the availability of goods and services as well as the change in the prices of these goods and services. Now, more formally, nominal GDP values output using current prices. That means if today I am measuring GDP, I will use today's output, today's quantities, and today's prices, the prices of the goods as they prevail today. Whereas real GDP, we are measuring the output using the prices of a base year. And that means if yesterday was my base, then if I am measuring today the GDP with reference to the prices prevailing yesterday, then naturally I am only capturing the change in the availability of goods and services when I am measuring the GDP growth. Let us see how the real GDP is corrected for inflation through an example. Suppose in an economy there are only two goods which are available, and the prices of the goods and the quantities of the goods that were sold is given in for 3 different years. In 2002, the quantity of pizzas were 400 units. In 2003, it became 500 units, and 2004 it was 600 units. And similarly, the quantities of ice cream which were say produced was 1000 units, 1100 units, and 1200 units. And the prices which prevailed in each of these years is given in the second and the fourth column. Now, if I were to compute the nominal GDP for 2002, assuming only these two commodities are produced in this economy, what it will be? If you recall, I have already said that GDP conceptually is nothing but summation of Pi Qi, where I is from 1 to n is 2 here, number of years are 3, the data that is provided. So I will get P1 Q1 plus P2 Q2. If you see, the GDP in 2002 will be 10 into 400 and 2 into 1000. So that gives me 6000. Whereas for 2003 it would be 11 into 500 plus 2.550 into 1100. And for 2004 it will be 12 into 600 and 3 into 1200. So the nominal GDPs are 6,000, 8,250 and 10,800. Now if suppose somebody wanted to compute the GDP growth, the nominal GDP growth, how much it turns out to, it is 37.5% in 2003 over 2002, and 39 and 31%, roughly 31% in 2004 over 2003. Now, this was growth with regard to the nominal GDP. Now let us try to compute the real GDP, and to compute the real GDP I need a base year. And suppose the base year, that means I will fix the prices as on base year and I will only track the quantities in the subsequent years. So suppose 2002 I take as the base year, that means I will freeze prices at 10 and 2 for pizza and ice cream respectively, and these prices I am going to use while computing the GDP for the subsequent years. Say for 2002 things do not change because I am using the 2002's prices and quantities as earlier when we were computing the nominal GDP. The real GDP also is the same to 6,000, but the change you can see when I am computing the real GDP for 2003, instead of using 11 as the price of Pisa, I am using 10, and instead of using 2.5, I am using 2, the base year prices. Now my GDP in 2003, which is the real GDP, is 7,200, and for 2004 it will be 10 into 600 plus 2 into 1200, which gives us 8,400. Now if I want to compute the GDP growth rate in 2003 over 2002 and 2004 over 2003, I get 20% and 16.7% only. Now, if just to put things in proper perspective, let us put both the numbers together in this slide. If you see, the growth of the nominal GDP was 37.5 and 30.9, whereas real GDP growth was only 20% and 16.7% respectively. Now, so what is making the change? Because I did not allow prices to change, that has resulted in a lowering of the GDP growth rate, and this GDP growth rate is coming from the increase in the availability of goods and services only, and we are not taking into account the price rise. In that sense, the real GDP is corrected for inflation. And just to reinforce, nominal GDP is measured using the then current prices, and real GDP is measured using constant prices from the base year, and in this example it was 2002. Now I will discuss with you in more detail in the classroom about a case study of change in base year and what impact it has on the growth estimates. We will study the case of Nigeria, which changed its base almost after 20 years, and when it changed its base from 89 to 2010, the impact it had on the growth rate of Nigeria, that was really startling, and it raised many questions about the utility of GDP as a measure to capture well-being. Before we proceed further, let us look at one thing. Let us take a more concrete example. This was the nominal GDP and real GDP portrayed on a single graph. If you see this this is for US, the nominal GDP behaved as per this maroon color graph, and the blue color graph tells us the real GDP. Now, if you see, why is it that um, both the nominal GDP and real GDP, as we have already seen in our previous example, hypothetical example, that they are same, because I am using the in the base year the prices are the same, which is used to compute nominal and real GDP, and the quantities are also the same. But in the other years, there can be a divergence between nominal GDP and real GDP. In fact, if you see the nominal GDP in the post 2000 period, suppose 2000 was the base year, and post 2000 we find the nominal GDP is always higher than the real GDP in this case. But before 2000, nominal GDP is less than real GDP. Why these two curves intersect in this manner? It would not be difficult to appreciate, because we know nominal GDP is using, suppose say for 2004, when I am computing the nominal GDP, I am using prices of 2004 as well as the quantities of 2004, and whereas for 2004 the real GDP is relatively less. And why it is less? Because I am not allowing prices to change, because prices, if there were some inflation in the economy between 2000 to 2004, then it is obvious that the prices in 2004 would be higher than the prices prevailing in 2000, and because we are using a higher price indicator to compute the nominal GDP. My nominal GDP is higher, and when I'm computing the real GDP, I'm using the prices of 2000. As I'm using a lower price figure, my GDP for 2000, real GDP for 2004 is less than the nominal GDP. But for the years before 2000, if we think or if it was the case that there was inflation in the economy before 2000, what we are doing is that we are say let us take 96. In 1996, I am using the price when I am computing the nominal GDP in 1996. I am using the price level prevailing in 96 and the quantities of 1996, so I am getting the nominal GDP, which is less than the real GDP in the same year, because I am using the base year of 2000. What I'm using is the 2000 prices when I compute the real GDP in 96. And if there was inflation, then certainly the prices prevailing in 2000 would be higher than the prices prevailing in 1996. And because I'm using a higher price to compute the GDP, the real GDP in 96, the real GDP is higher than the nominal GDP. Well, this is the nominal GDP is less than the real GDP before the base year, and nominal GDP is above the is higher than the real GDP in the year subsequent to the base year. This is because there has been inflation in this economy. Now, the discussion of nominal and real GDP takes us to a very interesting concept of measuring inflation, which is the GDP deflator. Because we are measuring the GDP using today's prices, when I am using nominal GDP, and we are measuring real GDP using a base year price, then certainly one way to look at these two GDP measures, the nominal GDP and real GDP, is to use them to get an indicator of inflation or the price rise in the economy. Now, formally, the GDP deflator measures the overall level of prices with regard to the base year. Okay, so what it is the GDP deflator is the nominal GDP upon real GDP. Suppose if my nominal GDP is nothing but P1 Q1, whereas the real GDP is P0 Q1. So naturally, when I am using P1 Q1 upon P0 Q1, I am getting a measure of prices. Suppose I'm using the GDP in 2001, so and the base year was 2000. Then what I am getting, the GDP deflator for 2001 is telling me how much were prices in 2001 vis-a-vis the prices prevailing in 2000. So if I track the GDP deflator over the years, what I will get, how the price level is with regard to the base year in each of the subsequent years. So when I try to see how the price level has changed from one year to other, I will get get a measure of inflation. So one way to measure the economy's inflation is to compute the percentage increase in the GDP deflator from one year to the next, because the GDP deflator is telling me how the overall price levels are with reference to a base year, and how this overall price level is changing is will tell me the price pressure in the economy. Let us look at through our old example, which was, we had already computed that the nominal GDP and real GDP for 3 different years. Now, if we want to compute the GDP deflator, it is nominal GDP upon real GDP into 100, and because for 2002 nominal and real GDP is the same, so I get the GDP deflator as 100. For 2003, the GDP deflator, nominal GDP upon real GDP, this is my nominal GDP, this is the real GDP into 100, I get 114.6. And for 2004, the nominal GDP is how much? 10,800 divided by the real GDP 8,400, so I get 128.6. Now what we are saying is that in 2003, the overall price level with reference to the base year was 114.6, and the overall price level with reference to the base year is 128.6 in 2004. Now inflation is measuring what? How the average level of prices are changing from one period to the next. So if I were to measure the inflation rate in 2003, it will be 114.6 minus 100, so it is 14.6%. Now if we were to ask what was the inflation rate in 2004, one response could be it is 28.6%, but that is not correct, because inflation is not measuring how much the price level had changed with reference to the base year, but the base year is at the underline. Now we are trying to measure how much price level had changed from the previous year. So how much prices have changed in 2004 vis-a-vis 2003. So that will give us 128.6 minus 114.6 upon 114.6. Please remember this, that when you are measuring inflation by any measure, we will see whether it is through by WPI or CPI or by the GDP deflator, you have to compute the inflation rate with reference to the previous time period. If it is the annual inflation, then you capture the price level prevailing 1 year before. If it is a monthly inflation number you are computing, find out the price level prevailing in the previous month and how much price level has changed in this month vis-a-vis the previous month. As we will see subsequently, the GDP deflator measure, unlike the other measures of inflation like WPI or CPI, is the most comprehensive measure of inflation, because we are capturing all the activities in the economy to arrive at the price pressure in the economy. Our next discussion would be to take up the discussion of inflation at a more detailed level. But before that, we will conclude the session on GDP by discussing another way of measuring GDP, which is the GDP by the purchasing power parity measure.